When it comes to Space Marines, I love the Black Templars. And when it comes to Black Templars, I love me a little Crusader squad. Number 1 is one of the best combat units in the game, but number 2, it represents the fluff perfectly. You see, the Black Templar are not like other Space Marine chapters. We're not like other girls who follow the Codex Astartes. Typically, Space Marines recruit from their chapter homeworld. On the 7th moon under the stars on the 12th day, all of the aspirants come forward and they are inducted into the Space Marine trials. Black Templar are a little different. We are a crusading fleet without a chapter homeworld. So basically people just show up and are like, can I be a Space Marine? And then the Black Templar are like, sure. Fight Larry, and if you survive longer than 10 seconds, we'll put you in the chapter. Now there's a lot more to it than that, and a lot of aspirants die, but those who don't become neophytes, Space Marine Scouts, and they are sent right to the front lines as the squire of an initiate, a fully fledged battle brother, to fight by their side, maybe being a little bit of a meat shield, maybe being a little bit of a Space Marine in training, and that is represented in the Space Marine Crusader squad. This is one of my original Crusader squads from back in the day of Warhammer 6th edition. Back then, you had to buy a box of Tactical Marines, then buy a box of Scouts, and give them all close combat weapons and mix them together. These guys got me through many a game, and the great rebasing of 2015 when Games Workshop introduced the 32mm base. But they were so bad in game, I ended up dropping the Scouts, tearing off the Marines' power plants, and replacing them with jump packs so that they could do something on the battlefield. Fast forward to now, and the Primaris Crusader squad comes with Scouts included, and it is amazing. These sculpts are incredible, blending modern Space Marine armor with the classic medieval heraldry of the Black Templars. They are glorious, and it's fun to see the classic lore upheld, with Scouts making it into the box. The Primaris Crusader squad box set the new standard of how cool Black Templars can look, and I want the rest of my army to match. Games Workshop came out with a revamped Scout box, so I have all of the miniature fodder I need. I just need to get a little better at sculpting. I have been tinkering with an idea for the past few months. The Crusader squad is perfect, but neophytes really should be represented in more than just Crusader squads. They should be seen in all Space Marine roles, and so I started to try and make some Black Templar neophytes for Assault Intercessor squads. My first few tries of sculpting their cloaks was, well, it was a first try. The big problem I ran into was the putty was too soft to sculpt on when it was between their legs. I basically got some floppy rectangles into place. I did have some success sculpting on top of the cured putty, and I want to revisit this and try again to get some neophytes that look as cool as the Crusader squad neophytes, but who serve in the Assault Marine role. I've sculpted some things, but I wouldn't say I'm a sculptor. I'm a bit of a neophyte when it comes to my sculpting journey. On my kitbashing journey, I feel like I am at the end. I can make things out of plastic, but I've got more ideas in my head. And to get those ideas from my head onto my miniatures, I gotta be able to invent those. And to do that, I have some tools. I've got the ubiquitous green stuff, I've got the ever popular milliput, and I have a new contender, Tamiya epoxy putty. This stuff seems very good and very expensive. I want to play around and see what material I'm most comfortable with and see if I can actually produce some good looking custom made bits. First, I need to fix up the rectangular boogers I made before. I threw a little sanding ball into my Dremel tool and ground the putty so that it was nice and flat, brushing away the dust so I have something clean to sculpt on top of. Then I used my hobby knife to square up the corners and the whole thing popped off. I super glued it back down, but it brings up an important point that the putties are sticky, but they're not glue, and they're not the strongest bond. For my first try, I'm going with the classic green stuff. I don't know if my green stuff is getting old, but I feel like the blue half is getting tough. And I find warming it up with a hairdryer makes it a lot more workable. Once it was nice and toasty, I can knead it together. Now for shaping it. First I want to try to make the bit of cloth hanging down from his chest piece. I put a small drop of super glue down and then squished the putty onto it. Then I grabbed a silicone sculpting tool and started shaping, dragging the blob down towards his belt. This worked, and I used water to keep the brush moist, but it was still gripping and sticking to the tool. I also put on too much and I had to cut off the excess, but after some more fussing, I was able to make a convincing rectangle and angled it down to his belt. I used a round silicone brush to work in some more wrinkles. Holding it up to one of Games Workshop Scouts, it's not too far off, a little chunky, but it gets the job done. Now for the crotch banner. I want that wrinkly flowing cloth look, and I think the trick is gonna be working one shape at a time. I made up a triangle blob of putty and then glued it right under his belt buckle. I used my sculpting tool to drag the triangle down and flatten it out, and I ended up with a blob coming off the side that I worked into my first wrinkle. I made up a long thin worm that I stuck down to the other side of the triangle and pressed it into the putty, flattened it out so it joined the first blob. This worked, and I made another worm for the other side. This chisel-shaped sculpting brush worked really well for dragging it down the length of the cloth to make trenches. And the green stuff was tough enough that it took a good amount of pressure to work in the details. With lots and lots of back and forth, I was able to get something that resembled the Games Workshop Scouts. And where the OG putty looked good, I left it alone. Now to try something else, making purity seals. I rolled my blob out flat and then wetted my hobby knife so I could cut some tiny strips. I super carefully lifted these into position and then poked and prodded them until I had a slightly big but pretty good looking purity seal. A wet toothpick worked well for the fine tuning, and for the wax seal, I cut down a little ball of green stuff, squished it flat, and then poked it with the tip of a syringe bottle. This leaves behind a little round dent, and I squished the middle flat and smoothed it out with the sculpting tools I have. I think these purity seals are looking pretty good. I started making some more, I put another on his holster of his pistol, and I was super careful not to squish any of the work I already did. I have done that a lot in the past. Now I could use a little more area to sculpt on. I glued on a jump pack, sanding his back nice and smooth so I could plastic glue this on. Scouts don't wear power armor, so I hope he's got really strong knees to support this jetpack. I threw on another seal for his engine, and it's been a few hours of sculpting and the green stuff is starting to harden. I think it's helping for the square tassels, but it's fighting me on the little wax seals. I made up a little rectangle of putty, ripped up the bottom parts, and then used the tip of my syringe bottle to make a little piece of cloth pinned to his jetpack. This was probably a lovely banner before takeoff, but now it's a mess. I'm very pleasantly surprised with green stuff. I've always had green stuff in my collection, and the reason I got other stuff is because I was never completely happy with green stuff and its rubberiness, and it's not quite perfect. I feel like with green stuff, you kind of have to guesstimate what size of a blob of green stuff you want, and then you put it on the model, and then you push around that blob, and if it turns out that that's too big a blob, you're kind of stuck with that blob, and so you kind of just gotta play the blobs you're dealt, but I'm pretty happy with this. Now to try doing the same thing, but with some milliput. For this little scout, I want the cloth to come all the way up to his tubes. I carved off the Imperialis, sanding it smooth with a sanding twig, and then I dremeled away a bit of his armor so I could have more room to work. Then I mixed up a nice ball of put. I use milliput almost every day for my models' bases. It's the perfect thing for gap filling and making rocks, and now I want to see if it can sculpt. I rolled my ball out flat and then cut a rectangle that looked about right for the top half of his cloth. I laid this onto the mini and then fine-tuned it to size. I started shaping it with my ball tool, but it gave up on this pretty quick. Unlike green stuff, milliput is really soft and the ball just sank in, so I started using my chisel tool to work the putty. I worked in a fold right under his neck and around his sides, and it was taking form really quickly. I worked in another fold and the top was done. Time for the bottom. This scout's legs are really close together, so I think I can just shove a blob in between and get to work shaping. I found my tools made marks super easily, which was almost a problem. But it was also really easy to add new material, with the new putty mixing into the old putty really nicely. And although I'm not completely satisfied with the wrinkles I made, I think that's more on me than the putty. It's looking pretty good. Okay, milliput is super interesting. It is incredibly sculptable. If anything, too sculptable. I felt like every single microscopic mark that I made left an impression in the putty, and that led to a little bit of a rougher, more uneven surface, but I felt like I was able to do a little bit more of what I wanted. But I have heard whisperings around the campfire of mixing milliput with green stuff, and that supposedly gives you the best of both worlds, so I feel like I gotta give that a try. I made up equal balls of all the stuffs and then mixed them together, and they did mix perfectly. I assumed the milliput's slightly sandy texture wouldn't perfectly blend, but it did. This mix turned into a very pale green. I rolled this out flat and then cut a piece, and it's definitely felt like an in-between green stuff and milliput. It was rubbery like green stuff where the surface pinched and warped with my tools, but I definitely needed to push harder into the putty to make a mark. Since this Marine has got such an extreme angle to his torso, I worked in some wrinkles and these formed really well. On his crotch banner, I decided to go back to putting down blobs, forming them into the wrinkles, starting with the big triangle and then working outwards, adding more and more little worms of putty. The more dynamic flappiness of this pose helped a lot, and I was able to get my most convincing cloth yet. I used up my leftover putty to make some more purity seals, and these I felt like didn't turn out as good as my green stuff seals. I was definitely fighting the putty. After only an hour and a half, the putty was already curing and getting pretty tough to work with. I am pleasantly surprised. Milliput plus green stuff? Kind of a banger. I didn't think it would change that much, but it is kind of the best of both worlds. You get a little bit more fidelity from the milliput, but you do get the workability of the green stuff. I am very surprised. Next up is the Tamiya epoxy putty, and I played around with this a little bit, and it does seem very, very nice. But this stuff is like 10 bucks an ounce, where green stuff is like 6 bucks an ounce. Like, if I don't need to buy more of this, then I can just use green stuff and milliput, which is also pretty cheap. I don't know. This stuff does seem very nice though. This stuff is weird. It starts out very sticky and soft. Much more sticky than green stuff, but also much softer like milliput. This is what I used for my first try to make these crotch banners, and it behaves a lot more like green stuff. I also really like the color. It's very easy to see what you're doing with this tan color. I started doing my usual triangles and worms, and it was behaving a lot more like milliput. It is nice, and I found it really easy to work in my shapes, but really hard to get a smooth finish. Eventually I got something I was happy with, and this stuff has the same benefit as milliput where it sands really easily once it's dry. Maybe this stuff needs some post-processing to really shine. I tried to roll this out flat to make some purity seals, but currently it is too fresh and sticky. I bet I could leave it alone for about 30 minutes to get something that flattens better. I took what I had and worked on resculpting this Marine's foot. I cut it off so I could have his toe pointing down like he's just taken off, and I re-glued his toe on and then filled it in with this putty. This worked really well. I feel like having that hard plastic behind it let me press much harder into the putty, and that helped me get a smoother finish. I grabbed another blob of this stuff for his heel. I was able to get something that resembled his other foot, but when I pushed from the right, it would lean a little bit to the left, and vice versa. This stuff probably needs some kind of a skeleton to work off of. I used some more putty to sculpt in the texture for the bottom of his boots, and then I compared, and overall, it's about the same as the rest of my tries. After everything had dried overnight, I used my Dremel tool to fix up the bottoms of all the banners, and I didn't really worry about the backs much. It took me hours to sculpt the fronts, so the backs, they can just be a little mushy. The milliput and Tamiya putty sanded the best. The green stuff really didn't like being sanded, and the green stuff milliput blend could be sanded, but it wasn't great. You know what always takes sanding like a dream? That's right, our website. EonsOfBattle.com is the place to find our merch and the best way to support us doing what we do with a membership. Each month, members get a credit that they can use on our new monthly terrain packs or any previous pack we have ever made. This April, we're going hard into skirmish fantasy warfare with 3 themes. The mythical forest, a set of fantastical trees held aloft by otherworldly levitating stones, and waterfalls with the power of life. The eternal graveyard, a desolate shrine to the forces of death, macabre headstones piled against the last remnants of a long-forgotten cemetery, and the Cannibal Camp, a ramshackle encampment where the marauders can divide up their spoils and cook up their victims. These sets are designed with storytelling in mind, and they're the right size and shape for games of Spearhead. You can match your theme to your army, making your beloved collection look good while dominating the battlefield. These sets are available on our website as STLs, and don't worry if you don't have a 3D printer, they're available physically printed for you. The Tamiya epoxy putty, a little bit tricky to use. It felt a lot like the milliput, but just with a little bit more rubbery give, kind of like green stuff, but I feel like the big winner was green stuff mixed with milliput. I actually really liked that. Now I've got some super unique spicy bodies and jetpacks. It is time to find what arms and armaments these guys are calling for. And a really cool thing about the new scouts, on the sprue, there's Mark 5B Godwin pattern bolters on a brand new Primaris kit, so I'm gonna have to use a couple of those. These minis are standing in as assault intercessors with jump packs armed with heavy bolt pistols and chain swords. I'm a sucker for WYSIWYG, but I also like cool things. I've already thrown some shotguns onto my scouts, not because I want to take shotguns in game, but because the shotguns just look so cool. So I don't mind if my minis are a little inaccurate if they are extra cool. Attaching my bolter, it just feels really right in my scout's hands. There's something to WYSIWYG, but then there's presence. This scout feels like he does mortal wounds on the charge. And I glued a sheath chainsaw to his butt. I had to gap fill the hole that usually holds grenades and pouches, but technically, this model is armed with a chainsword and bolt E weapon. Rule of cool wins. I finished filling up the rest of the mini with shoulder pads and a nice head, and this sucker was done. Now onto the lunging fella. I found a combat knife cocked and ready to stab, so this will be perfect, but I don't have any scout right hands with chainsword, so I'll have to invent this. I found an arm that's swinging down and cut away the original weapon, drilling a 1mm hole through his fist, and I inserted a length of brass rod. I capped this off with the top of a chainsword and the bottom of a handle. I stuck this onto the mini, and he might be my favorite. He looks super aggressive. After a head and shoulder pads, this guy is looking pretty. The next guy, I felt like his pose was calling for swinging a chainsword in his right arm, so I had to once again invent this. And this one was particularly tricky because I had to change the weapon and the angle of the wrist. I used a little blob of green stuff in between his joints and it ended up working. For his other hand, I went through every arm of the scout box and eventually landed on this knife arm. Black Templars love close combat, and the neophytes are especially zealous. For the last Marine, I got lucky and found 2 arms that looked good from the Crusader kit. I got lucky that I used some shotgun arms previously, so I had some extra neophyte close combat weapon arms kicking around, and these look good in the Marine, looking over for his next target as he rockets off into the sky. Now I have some truly one-of-a-kind scouts. I need to give them some bases, and for my Templars, that means pine bark nuggets. I found some big chunks to fill up these bases. I've got my Templars set in craggy desert cliffs, and I want these guys in extra mountainous terrain that their jetpacks would come in handy in. The pine bark gave me my natural look, but I still need to make sure that there's room for my Marine's feet to go, so I used some cork and superglue to build up more slots for standing. I glued down cork, tore it up so it looked natural, and then ground it flat. Then I drilled into my guy's feet and inserted some brass rods. These bases are so tall that I can use some pretty long pins for maximum strength. For Flying Guy, I made this base huge and then drilled a hole all the way up his leg, pinning all the way through the cork, wood, and then plastic base so that he's as strong as he can be. And I got the rest of the gang standing too. I feel like this batch of 4 is the perfect number to really give each guy the attention they deserve. Something else I feel like these bases are calling for are some skulls. My Templars famously have been battling Nyx orcs for the last 200 years, so a couple of orc skulls would look great. After the skulls, I used some milliput to blend the plastic bases into the cork and wood towers, and I coated these in a layer of wood glue and sprinkled on some small pebbles, coarse grit sand, and fine grit sand. Giving these guys one last once over, there's one little thing I need to do, and that's give these guys some more skulls. For my crusade, if a Marine dies in the line of duty, his skull is nailed to his armor before his equipment is given to the next guy, so he can crusade eternally. I used skulls from the Citadel Skulls box and sewing straight pins for the nails that hold these skulls firmly in place. My Black Templars army has now come full circle. Back on the Dizzy, I was turning my Tactical Marines into Assault Marines. Now I'm turning my Scouts into Assault Intercessors with jump packs. These guys will make the perfect proxies to make my army even more fluffy. They might not be as tall as a typical battle brother, but they'll make up for it with righteous zeal. Space Marine Scouts with jump packs is not something that exists. Games Workshop has never made a model for it, but it does exist in my army, and I think it makes perfect sense. How would an initiate know how to use a jump pack unless he trained with it as a neophyte? I am very proud of my custom crotch banners. Spending some serious time focused on sculpting has taught me a lot. And it taught me the value of green stuff plus milliput. I'm gonna be doing a lot more sculpting in the near future, hopefully on some more Space Marines, because I got big plans. I got 6 more scouts in this box, and I'm gonna use them. These 4 guys are gonna get paired off into 2 5-man assault intercessors with jump pack squads. Then I'm gonna take 4 more guys from this box and I'm gonna turn them into regular old intercessors. And then I'll have 2 left over, and I think for those 2, I'm just gonna build them normally but put the missile launchers on. If I'm gonna have a lot of scouts running around my army, and if I ever wanna put them into actual scout squads, those missile launchers will come in handy. Hopefully, sometime in the near future, I'll be able to consistently win games of 40K with my Black Templars, but until then, I'm gonna keep on painting. Thanks for watching.